It's 7 o'clock. I'm Dermot Monahan. You're watching Sky News Tonight and a special programme on a day of travel disruption. Coming up, the biggest railway strike in 30 years cuts services and causes transport pain for millions of people. Britain's biggest cities see an increase in congestion, but not perhaps as much as many had feared. An opportunity for those who can to work from home as offices empty and the number of people in city centres falls. As more unions threaten to strike, we look at what it might cost to meet their demands over public sector pay. A very good evening. It's been a day when train services were crippled and the roads congested more than usual. But there are questions about whether today's rail strikes actually caused the level of overall disruption that many had predicted. Footfall in major towns and cities was down, suggesting a lot of people ditched the commute and reverted to working from home once again. That, of course, brings consequences. Fewer people spending means less money flowing into the economy. So over the next hour, we're going to be looking at the costs that brings and also try to assess what impact meeting the pay demands of the strikers might have on the economy. But with the story of the day so far, here's our business correspondent, Paul Kelso.
The only arrivals at Manchester Victoria this morning came under their own steam. There were no trains to disturb the peace. The station shut down almost completely on day one of the first national rail strike in 30 years.
It's just after 8 at Manchester Victoria. It's peak rush hour. Well, not this morning. The only service running at all is the tram serving the city. Usually this would be full of passengers coming in and out of Leeds and Liverpool. But today, there's nothing.
It was a similar picture across the country, with London Underground shut down, fewer than 20% of overground services running anywhere, and large chunks of the country cut off, to the inconvenience of many.
There is no way I will work from home. I have to get to work. But now that everything has been disrupted,
At the end of the day, the end goal is to get better pay and better conditions. And if this is what we have to do, and I support the workers, then that's what has to be done.
We're going to Cambridge tomorrow to see a building. We were going to go by train, but we're going to drive now. Working people have the right to stand up for themselves, and if they don't feel that they're being offered the right deal, then I think anybody's got the right to strike.
As up to 50,000 RMT members walked out in a dispute over pay and conditions, the blame game resumed. The Prime Minister suggesting commuters should expect a long haul.
We need the union barons to sit down with Network Rail and the train companies and get on with it. And we need, I'm afraid, everybody, and I say this to the country as a whole, we need to get ready to stay the course.
Grant Shapps can come to the table if he wants. I'm not particularly bothered. But if he wants to come to the table, he'd be welcome, as long as he comes in a framework of goodwill. What he needs to do, really, is allow the management of the train operating companies and Network Rail the licence to get on with negotiating.
But while there was disruption, fears this solstice strike would be the longest day for travellers too were unfounded. Transport for Greater Manchester say road traffic was up just 2%, despite 80% of trains being cancelled. Primed by the pandemic, this was the day millions stayed at home. At this environmental consultant's, COVID accelerated a culture of flexible working. So when the strike was announced, they knew what to do.
Hasn't really affected me today. I'm working from home. I've chosen to work from home today, so it's pretty easy for me to just log on as I did through the pandemic working from home.
Talks between Network Rail and the RMT will resume on Wednesday, but services will remain disrupted ahead of further strikes that will come at a price for city centre businesses and test public patience and the appetite for compromise. Paul Kelso, Sky News in Manchester.
Look at the details. 4/5 of all trains were cancelled today. At 9 o'clock this morning, only 6% of the usual services were running. The rail strikes have also had an impact on traffic on the roads. During the morning rush hour in London, the time needed to make journeys by car was about 26% longer than those on previous Tuesdays at the same time. But many have opted to work from home, as you've been hearing. In Manchester, traffic was only 2% higher than the last 2 Tuesdays. So in London, strike action not only hit overground rail services, but also the underground as well, the tube. It contributed to journey times in London being hit more than anywhere else. Many of the city's workers were able to revisit their lockdown working arrangements and log on from home. But for others, that, of course, wasn't possible, as Ivor Bennett now reports.
Working from home is not an option for Tanya. She's a care manager whose patients rely on her and her team seeing them at home.
We'll have to provide their personal care, prepare their meals, get them out of bed. There's absolutely no way that they can go on today without us being there.
So without public transport, Tanya's husband has become chauffeur for the day.
So we can get her there early.
Crisscrossing West London to collect carers like Ty and deliver them to appointments.
They don't realise how many essential workers that actually get affected by it.
As well as the logistical headache, there's a financial one too, with fuel costs, congestion charges and extra hours for carers.
I really hope that it doesn't go on for much longer, because we can't go on like this. The carers will start getting tired after a few days. It's too much. They've got families.
Far too much for many school children too, with exams taking place regardless. Harriet and Emanuela were sitting A-level religious studies and took over an hour to get to college in East London.
It's really stressful because you want to be focusing on your revision instead of getting to school on time.
No electronic devices such as phones or music.
But as the exams started, one of their friends still hadn't arrived, leading to an anxious wait at the school gate.
We are hoping that she makes it through the gate by then.
The clock is ticking.
And the clock is ticking, yes.
The student eventually arrived 25 minutes late, by no means ideal preparation.
Good luck.
Remote working has definitely diminished the impact of this strike, but it's not just commuters who are affected, and it's not just this week, with warnings of knock-on effects to come long after the transport system goes back to normal. This GP surgery in Croydon is braced for a flurry of patients seeking new referrals after missing hospital appointments, a stretched service coming under further strain.
We know that in a couple of weeks' time there will be that inevitable swell of patients who were unable to attend their appointments, weren't able to get their investigations done, and there will be that massive swell of administrative work that comes to us.
A strike confined to the railway, but with consequences far and wide. Ivor Bennett, Sky News.
And much of Scotland and Wales had to do without rail services altogether today. ScotRail cancelled 90% of its services, cutting off large parts of the nation. And Laura Bundock spent the day seeing how the disruption hit those in the likes of Glasgow and Dundee and sent this report.
Glasgow Central and Scotland's busiest station, almost empty. No rush at rush hour. In fact, very few chancing commutes.
I take just train. It's faster for me, it's easier, it's more comfortable. And so if they're not working, it's going to be very stressful for me.
Because of COVID, we've had the work from home, so I don't think it's going to be as disruptive as what it could have been. So I don't think it'll have too much of an impact.
90% of trains have been cancelled. Alice bought a ticket but was going nowhere. She's freelance and won't get paid.
So I usually get the train to work at 20 to 9 and I'm not getting it today. So that's that. That is what it is.
Passengers had been warned to stay at home. With a skeleton service and no trains north of Falkirk, the strike hit Scotland hard.
ScotRail staff aren't actually part of this dispute, but without Network Rail staff, they can't run trains, which is why there are only 5 routes operating across the whole of Scotland.
In Aberdeen, not one commuter, but several stranded tourists.
I'm trying to catch my flight back to the US. I think there's a flight that'll go through Dublin, so that's the backup plan.
I'm hoping to get to my friend in London, but I'm not sure if the trains will work there either.
The trains certainly weren't working at Dundee, and neither were the taxi drivers.
I'll stay for a wee bit longer, but if it's not going to work, then I might as well just go home, eh?
Because it's just a bit silly, is it really?
Passengers for the 12:10, Perth Broxton.
It was busier on the buses. Alan and Jane are just back from a Scottish Isle cruise.
There we are, on board the ship. Nice calm weather.
But their journey home now the longest leg.
We took advantage of the cruise liner bringing us to Glasgow Central Station, but of course no trains, so we decided we'd travel back to Aberdeen on the bus.
Most people stayed away, resigned and ready for the strike that brought Scotland's stations to a standstill. Laura Bundock, Sky News, Glasgow.
Well, of course, the strikes have affected many other areas right across the United Kingdom, as in other major cities. In Liverpool, the lack of trains saw an increase in other forms of public transport and taxi services being used. Services on Merseyrail, Avanti, Northern and TransPennine have all been disrupted. While staff at Merseyrail aren't taking part in the industrial action, the operator says because Network Rail staff operate the signalling systems, it is unable to provide any train services on strike days. And people in Wales are dealing with the biggest rail strike for 30 years, with less than 10% of services running. No trains are running west of Cardiff or north of Merthyr Tydfil on any of these strike days. But some travellers going into London remain hopeful about the situation.
2 years ago, we booked to go and see Yes at the Albert Hall, and due to COVID and people dying, it's been kicked down the road twice. And, of course, the day that they choose to play is the day of the rail strike, which we're looking forward to, actually, aren't we? We're very optimistic that it's all going to run smoothly, and, in fact, we're quite enjoying the peace and quiet. So thank you, Mr RMT and Mr Lynch, I believe.
Well, the strike's certainly going to dominate tomorrow's papers. We'll have our press preview and news review from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's papers, headlines as well. Joining us will be the columnist with the I newspaper, Ian Dunt, and Anita Boateng, broadcaster and former Conservative special advisor. You're watching Sky News Tonight. Coming up next, your questions on the travel disruption answered by our panel of experts. Do join us for that.
The world seems to be becoming more and more divided. Issues around politics, culture, the pandemic are resulting in vastly opposing viewpoints, causing real rifts between us. I want to get in the middle of those debates. I want to better understand where each stance comes from and whether there's room for compromise. Join me, Trevor Phillips, as we look to find common ground on Sky News.
Push the protesters further back here. There's around 200 or 300 still remain.
I'm Dan Whitehead and I'm Sky News' West of England correspondent.
This van goes onto the streets of Plymouth 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
These facilities at the moment are a lifesaver. It's all we've got.
From fishing communities to bustling cities, we spend every day reporting from across the region, hearing from people who have real stories.
I'm going to have nowhere to live for about 3 or 4 months.
There are still people inside the properties here.
They're coming from the epicentre of what is now a global health pandemic. We were seeing and speaking to young women who were selling themselves right on the high street. It was desperately sad, and the fact it was happening right in the heart of this community. Before Brexit, these oysters were being exported to the EU, but the trade stopped overnight. What's your feeling about the future then?
Bleak. Might all be finished, I don't know.
The inspiration behind our product came from understanding how big of a problem livestock methane emissions were.
Welcome back. Well, as promised, we're going to use the next half an hour or so to try to answer your questions about the travel disruption, particularly on the railways across the United Kingdom. Our panel tonight is the Conservative MP and member of the Transport Select Committee and former member of the RMT, it should be said, Chris Loader. We have the travel editor of the Sun newspaper, Lisa Minow, and the chief economist with KPMG, Yael Selfin. Very good to see you all. Thank you very much indeed. We've had lots of questions ranging right over the subject matter. So let's dive straight in on this one. And a very simple question. I'm going to put this to you, Lisa, because it's a simple question, but it's more complex than it seems, isn't it? It is. Why are rail workers striking? What are they striking for? Because, of course, it's not just about pay. That's what people kind of concentrate on.
No, it's not just about pay. This is about the conditions that they're working in, pensions, and on top of that, it's about whether or not certain jobs are going to be no longer required in the modern new railway service that the government is trying to actually put forward. They're saying that actually some jobs that are currently being done by staff, including Network Rail staff and train company staff, no longer need to be done by actual people, and a lot of it could be automated. And that is something that is really, ringing alarm bells with the unions. They're saying that safety should be the first issue, and that's part of the reason why they're on strike. So yes, it's pay, but it's also about conditions, working conditions for jobs. On top of that, pensions, and then whether or not these roles are going to be, sort of going on into the future, or whether these roles are going to be made redundant, and then whether that's going to impact them and have job losses as a result. Yeah, a huge number of issues there, which is why the talks and the negotiations were going on so long. And that's our next question following on from that. Chris Loader. Why doesn't the government hold talks with the companies immediately to resolve these issues, as the Department for Transport own some of the companies? And this, of course, is something, as you know, that the opposition have been calling for, cut out the middle management, so to speak, and, go to the government. It's the government, after all, that holds the purse strings ultimately.
So in these sorts of situations, employees and employers have their discussions and their negotiations. We have 13 train operators involved with this. We have Network Rail, totalling roughly 40,000 staff from 14 different organisations. Each organisation has a different set of terms and conditions, has different salaries and so on. And so the negotiation it is right, in my opinion, that takes place with the employer in the regular way. It's very clear from my perspective, though, that as time goes on, this is becoming more and more ideological, and that is ultimately why I believe that the RMT wants to bring this to a head with the government. And as it stands at the moment, if we just turn the clock back maybe less than a month, the result of the strike ballot was on the 24th of May. Mm-hmm. That was 2 days before pay talks started for a good number of the organisations that are involved with this. So from my perspective, what we've seen is the RMT jumped the gun quite a bit here. They have not completed. In some cases,
I get the whys and wherefores, and as we
Mm.
say, these discussions, negotiations have been going on for an awful long time. They're very complex. They involve a lot of issues. We get all that, but I suppose this question gets to the nub of it. Ultimately, if more money is involved, and more money will be involved if there's a pay rise, and indeed for any reorganisation that takes place, the government ultimately holds the purse strings. It puts billions upon billions, as you know better than all of us, into the railways.
Well, it does now, but it didn't before the pandemic. So the operating part of the railway, what we call wash its face, so it didn't require public subsidy. It was over the period of the pandemic where we saw £16 billion have to be invested in the railway to keep it going. The first quarter alone was £3.5 billion. And as a result of the pandemic, we have seen passenger journeys have not returned to their levels. They're 75%. Passenger revenues are a little over a half. So the real issue here is the lack of passenger revenue here rather than taxpayer funds.
OK, well, let's talk more about the pay rise. As I say, I suppose the headline issue, the one that a lot of people have grasped, and our next question addresses that. And Yael Selfin, I mean, to put this into overall context, I suppose, in terms of the economy and, of course, the inflationary background to these talks and so many others, the questioner says, I can't understand how a 5 to 7% pay rise is so unrealistic, given that what inflation is now, am I correct, 9% forecast to go to 11%. So the pay demand is actually under the rate of inflation.
Yes, it is. But what we have seen generally is that pay increases have been lower than the rate of inflation. We've seen an average pay of around 4%, with some of the private sectors seeing some price increases on average of around 6%, for example, in the hospitality sector, but others in business services and the like, slightly lower at around 5%, with on average public sector workers only gaining around 1.8% increase. So we've seen a very varied distribution of wage increases and generally below inflation. What we need to bear in mind is that inflation at the moment is very high. Businesses are under quite a lot of pressure in terms of the margin, in terms of the overall cost. And with the constraint on supply chains, etc., it's not always that easy for them to pass on that increase in cost when overall consumers are under pressure as well when it comes to their spending power.
Crucial in terms of when it comes to pay demands, the future outlook is that it will go back. I mean, the Bank of England seem to be suggesting it'll go back to around the 2% mark in, 18 months' time. Is that just sticking their finger in the air and hoping rather than any deep inside knowledge?
Well, this is the expectation of most economists. So if you look at our focus, and they're based on our modelling, and that's like any other economist, we're expecting inflation to start moderating quite significantly from the middle of next year and to reach the Bank of England target by the second quarter of 2024. So that is a fairly fast deceleration in inflation. We are expecting the sharp increases, especially in energy prices, to fall from the year-on-year calculation, if you like, of inflation by the middle of next year, largely. So this is probably the estimation of most of economists, and it is crucially based on the hope that you're not going to get that sort of price wage spiral. So you get the rising wages then escalated to a rise in prices, and then again we've seen that moving freely all the time, that dynamic. It's no longer down to an external shock. That is what the Bank of England is trying to prevent by controlling its inflation expectation and by hoping that we will have this one-off inflationary shock and that's it.
OK, so that's the inflationary background and potentially the outlook. Specific question for you, Lisa Minnow, another member of the public, asked this, another straightforward one. How safe is it to travel tomorrow? And I guess behind that question is not about physical safety, but about the idea that there will still be disruption in spite of it not being a strike day.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, there is going to be an impact into tomorrow with the Network Rail, signallers particularly being part of this strike. There will not be people sort of going into the night, so services will literally be running from about 6:30 tomorrow morning. Now, that's much later than normal. Normally, it's a lot more, it's a lot earlier in the morning that services would start and signallers would be there on the job. So that is going to mean that probably about 60% of the, sort of Network Rail and services will but still be impacted in the morning, I would say, but hopefully by lunchtime, and particularly in London where, trains aren't having to go very long distances to actually get to where they need to be. It should actually sort of quicken up and you should actually get much better services, early on in the morning, I would say. But there is still going to be an impact from first thing, I would say, and up to 60% could still be impacted across the country tomorrow. OK, thanks for that, Lisa. Chris, here's a question. Why isn't the nationalisation, well, renationalisation, I guess, of the rail networks an option? Because, the model's already changed from the original privatisation model.
I didn't think this strike was meant to be about the pros and cons of nationalisation, although I suspect some of those on the opposition side
Wouldn't it make
may
it
think
simpler
so.
to run the whole thing?
Well,
again,
I think
instead of all these different train operators we discussed about in the negotiations before, and all these different layers of management and quangos, you've just got the railways.
Yeah, there's a couple of important things just to note. Rail privatisation since the early 90s has injected enormous private investment. It has doubled passenger numbers during that time. It has really grown the railways in a way we have not seen in our lifetime. What we saw through the pandemic, though, was a huge shock to the industry, which meant that passenger numbers, passenger demand was impacted hugely. I remember during the peak of the pandemic, passenger numbers were something like 8 or 9, maybe 10% of what they were expected to be. So the situation we're faced with now, it is debatable whether some, including the unions, want to use this as a vehicle to renationalise the railways. It's my opinion that that's not the right thing to do. The railways, as I've just outlined, have grown hugely, but the government has also put forward only a matter of months ago, plans to change the structure of the railway to make it better, to improve some of the key issues of which passengers have experienced, and to deal with some of the complexities in privatisation that in some cases started to outweigh the strengths of the previous model. OK, great questions, some great answers from you all. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to take a break now, and plenty more of these questions coming your way. After the break, we're going to be asking, amongst other things, how other public sector workers could also demand pay increases and the implications, therefore, for the overall economy.
The plan is to take the political temperature midweek. So we'll be discussing the biggest stories of the week so far, talking about what's still to come, having a look at Prime Minister's questions, of course, and getting a reaction from politicians, plus our very own viewers. And we'll have analysis from my Sky News colleagues.
The Take with Sophie Rich on Sky News.
Welcome back to Sky News Tonight and this programme about today's travel disruption and that to come. Well, it's not just, of course, rail workers who are angry about levels of pay and their working conditions. Unions representing, amongst other things, teachers, nurses, refuse collectors and barristers have all said that they may strike as well, and many others as well. And today, a union representing 115,000 postal workers said it was going to ballot members about possible strike action. Our data and economics editor, Ed Conway, has been looking at what it might cost the government to deliver better pay for the public sector.
As the cost of living crisis intensifies, there's likely to be more in the way of industrial action, with inflation quite so high. But let's just have a look back at the history of strikes going all the way back a century or so. This shows you the number of days lost to strikes. So the higher the bars are, the more strikes, basically, there have been. And look, 2011, the last year when there were lots of public sector strikes, it's actually not that high, is it? Nowhere in comparison with, for instance, 1970s. There's the Winter of Discontent, 1979. Or, indeed, looking all the way back to 1926, that incredibly high bar there, that's the general strike, really just unprecedented level of disruption for the UK economy back then. And consider what we might be going into now in this year. You're talking about public sector pay, a lot of focus on that and a lot of focus on whether it's kept track with private sector pay. These bars show you how much they've increased over the past 22 years or so. So going back to the millennium, you can see private sector pay, public sector pay, both have gone up quite considerably. But here's the thing, now let's just look back to 2010 and it's a different story. So since 2010, private sector pay up by 4.3%, inflation adjusted. Public sector pay down by 4.3% inflation adjusted. And that's why a lot of people are saying there needs to be more given to public sector workers right now. But the question, of course, is how much can the Chancellor afford? This shows you how much is spent in total by the public sector. So total public spending, just over £1 trillion. Here is public sector pay. Pay review bodies, so it's split up between pay review bodies and non-pay review bodies. And if you kind of add them both up, you get to about £230 billion. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that slice, £230 billion, we'll put that over there, and we'll work out how much it costs to increase it in line with inflation. So first of all, the inflation that the government thought we were going to be getting, 2 to 3%, that would cost an extra £7 billion or so. But of course, inflation is far higher than that. It's running at about 9%, or expected to be 9% this year. And if you're going to raise it in line with that, you're talking about £21 billion. And the difference between those two things, it comes out at about £14 billion. £14 billion. What's that amount to? Well, if we take that slice and just put it over there, let me compare it to a couple of things. First of all, it's about the same as cutting income tax, all of the main rates of income tax, by 2%, which is precisely what this government would like to do. It comes to about the same amount raised by the Health and Social Care levy, and you know how controversial that was. So it just underlines it. The Chancellor's got some difficult decisions to make in the next few months. Is it going to be inflation rises for the public sector? Is it going to be tax cuts? It's going to be a really interesting period for economic policy.
Interesting. It's one way of putting it. Ed Conway there, our data and economics editor. Well, our panel of experts is still here with me. We have, let me reintroduce them to you, the Conservative MP and member of the Transport Select Committee and former member of the RMT, Chris Loder, travel editor of The Sun, Lisa Minow, and chief economist at KPMG, Yael Selfin. Very good to see you all again, and plenty more questions sent to us by Sky News viewers and listeners. This one is about, I suppose, some of the issues that Ed Conway was addressing. If Boris Johnson wants a high-wage economy, surely a 9% increase would support this. I'll get the economic picture in a moment with Yael Selfin. But Chris Loder, you know, we heard Boris Johnson last year. That was all the talk at the conference, wasn't it? A high-wage economy. Well, you know, what's wrong then with some pretty big pay increases?
Well, I don't think that proper pay increases or adequate pay increases in this respect have been ruled out. This is the whole point, you know, that the strikes that we are faced with today on the railways means that the majority of those businesses that we just outlined have not actually concluded their pay negotiations or pay discussions. So I think this whole topic area, we run the risk of sort of jumping the gun with it, because I don't think we have a firm proposal on the table where unions can say, actually, I fully disagree with that. So I don't think that is the case.
What do you think the government should say in this particular dispute? Well, the government thinks, OK, well, you know, 5 to 7%, that's not bad as long as then we get the reform and the reorganisation as well.
No, I don't think that, because I think the complexity of the railways means that you have to be very clear about what those other things are. So for example, different parts of the railway will have a 34 or 35-hour working week. Other parts of the railway will have a 42-hour working week, but maybe there are other terms and conditions that affect those. So I think it needs to be done in the round, and that's why the full conversation is required before we jump into strike action.
OK, Jan, in that issue of the question is suggesting something like a 9% increase, that's bang on the inflation number, as we've discussed at the moment. I mean, clearly a high-wage economy, I mean, everyone wants to see that, but doesn't it require then productivity increases to allow us to have it?
Well, absolutely. There's a number of issues here. One is, if you want to keep everything equal, if you like, if you want to get higher pay, you probably need to produce more for it. Otherwise, things cost more. So if they cost more, it means that people then have to pay more for them. So it's just higher inflation, essentially. Or you need to, if it's in the case of public sector, essentially you need to increase taxes in order to pay for that, unless you start cutting services.
OK, well, thank you very much indeed for that, Lisa Minnow. We've got this one again about the knock-on effects of the strike on the days right before and after strike days. The question asks, how serious should we expect those to be on the tube? That, of course, is in London, and on intercity rail services. Just give us your view once again.
Well, I mean, I think there is going to be disruption. There's no way of getting around that. But it definitely won't be anywhere near as bad as what we've seen today. I mean, this is, the first major strike, we've seen in this sense for 30 years. Yes, there is going to be issues tomorrow, but I would imagine that, genuinely, after the morning rush hour tomorrow, there should hopefully be, a correction and services starting to get back up and running. But saying that, my particular rail company is Thameslink. They haven't actually had staff strike action this week. They voted against it in terms of their own staff members. But unfortunately, because of Network Rail and the fact that all of the train operating companies require Network Rail to run the railways in the way that they do, they are still impacted. They're unable to put on the services they want. And it's a major commuter route into London. So I think there's going to be an impact throughout the week. And we're going to see, far less services than we would normally expect. And those services, when they do come in, are going to be very busy.
Got another question then about the pay demands, and I want to turn this question around ever so slightly and put it to you, Yael Selfin. The question is, why do rail staff feel they can strike when other business sectors are also not seeing any pay increases? And let me ask you about that. I mean, what is happening with both public sector pay? We know that there are many pay review bodies looking at that. What's happening in the private sector at the moment? What's the overall rate of increase? Well, I suppose it's a decrease in actual fact when it's inflation adjusted.
Yeah, absolutely. So across the board, we see across all sectors a real hit on pay. So it is very rare on average for sector to see a rise in nominal wages that is higher than the unprecedented almost increase in inflation that we have at the moment. And therefore, we have a real decline across the board. It's just a question of how bad it is for different industries, with some, especially those with higher vacancy rates, seeing slightly higher nominal pays, and others seem slightly lower, so they're hit a bit more. But we also need to take things in perspective, in a slightly longer term perspective, and also look at other things like other conditions that people have. Some people have higher pensions or different type of pensions that is more favorable than others. So the overall pay package is not the whole package that some employers have. We probably need to compare a little bit more in terms of the overall conditions as well.
OK, very good point. Back to the rail workers specifically. Chris Loader, this I suspect coming from a rail worker, says not all rail workers are on 46,000. I think that's the kind of average figure that's been given. I'm not. I struggle to pay my bills. Can I have assurance my job is safe? And this is part of the negotiations, isn't it? No compulsory redundancies.
So Over the past year or a little bit longer than that, the railways have been running a voluntary redundancy programme that has been hugely oversubscribed. I think as part of a negotiation and/or settlement, a reopening of that voluntary redundancy programme will enable that very point to happen. I'm clearly not close enough to know the numbers and so on, but I think we're in the situation where, I can't recall the last time compulsory redundancies were put forward for frontline grade groups in the railways. I can't recall it. I would be very surprised if that were as part of a final negotiation and agreement. But of course, that is where we will need to get to, because at the end of the day, despite all the difficulty that we're experiencing now, there will be an agreement at the end of the day.
But then you're saying it can all happen through so-called natural wastage, but you always get that happening, not necessarily in the areas you want it to, so you end up with a reorganisation at the very least.
I'm not quite talking about natural wastage and natural attrition. I'm talking about that, since the end of the really impacting part of the pandemic, passenger numbers have been down considerably. The yields of those journeys have been down. Overall revenue has been roughly just under 2/3 of what it was before. The industry has already taken some steps, and they found in that process that their voluntary redundancy programmes were hugely oversubscribed. So I'd be surprised if we get that far. So I don't think it's...
Another broader economic question. So, Yael Selfin, strikes are poorly timed after the announcement of crippling living expenses. We know the cost of living crisis. Small businesses struggling and empty food banks, and can I add huge demand for them. How can we earn a living and reduce economy if we can't get to work post-COVID? Will this have another economic effect if it is only this week of strikes?
Well, it will have some impact. The good news is that a big chunk of the population can now work from home. We're well versed with that, and therefore it should have a more limited impact in that regard. And also the other good news is that these are just specific days. So unlike the lockdown that we had earlier, that was much more prolonged, with this time round, if we were having an appointment to the hairdresser or we were going to go out, we could just do it another day during the week or next week, and provided there's still space for us, we can still do that delayed consumption. So hopefully small businesses will be less impacted this time round than during the lockdowns that we had early on.
Here is hoping. I think this might have to be the last question. So, Lisa, I'm going to put it to you. We've been asked an awful lot of people asking about tomorrow and Friday. What about further down the line, excuse the pun? Can we expect rail services to be back to normal next week? I suppose that's slightly how long's a piece of string. We don't know whether the talks are going to resume and how much progress they may make. But there aren't any planned strikes next week, are there?
No, there are no planned strikes next week. So, as you said, it's a bit of a how long is a piece of string. We need to see whether or not the train companies are going to be able to sit down with the unions and actually work something that will actually be something that they can bring back to their members. We would possibly see, perhaps, if those talks fail again, similar type of strike action as we've seen this week. So days at a time with gaps in between, because I think for the unions, they've discovered that that's actually one of the more sort of the better ways for them to have an impact, because if they do it over 2 separate days with space in the middle, there's still going to be an ongoing impact in those days in the middle. So we'd hope that they can come to some kind of resolution, but there is every chance that this possibly could rumble on into the summer.
Yeah, just this dispute, Chris Loader, your thoughts on that, just this dispute, the RMT dispute, but of course we know that the train drivers who actually aren't involved in this dispute, represented by ASLEF, that they're balancing on strike action. It could go on, and the Prime Minister was saying it today, could go on for a long time, couldn't it?
Train drivers with an average salary of £57,000. And I think it's this sort of thing, this coordination of industrial action, that gives me real doubt as to the genuine motives behind these strikes. You're absolutely right. The mandate which was given to the RMT by its members on the 24th of May will go forward for 6 months, so it's the end of November. I suspect we are in for a pretty bumpy time. It feels to me that the trade unions are coalescing and aligning in order to have a fairly considerable fairly considerable ideological fight.
You don't think there's a point then at which the government will get involved?
Well, I think this is... You've got to bear in mind, the dispute when it comes to the railways is with employers.
Yeah,
it's not with the government. We have.
It goes on and on.
But, well, I'm just trying to think, what can the government solve which the employers can't? Now, the fact that, I don't know the other professions and other grade groups to understand their concerns or issues and so on, but I think that there is a real need to sort out the genuine issues and concerns with the employers about, because, the unions tell us it's not just about pay, there are other things as well. They need to be sorted out, and trying to build this into an enormous ideological spat, is not the way to do that.
OK, well, listen, thank you all. We are out of time. Thank you all very much indeed for your time. Chris Loader, Lisa Minnow and Yal Selfin. Very good to see you all, and thank you very much indeed for sharing your huge expertise and knowledge with us all here on Sky News Tonight. And you're watching Sky News Tonight. Well, coming up next, we're going to be staying with that issue and looking at it from Labour's perspective. How would the opposition handle the strike? I'll be talking to the Shadow Attorney General, Emily Thornberry.
The situation is not huge chaos. There is undoubtedly problems, particularly at a number of UK airports, most notably Manchester, Heathrow and Gatwick, where either the airport security or the baggage handling providers are short-staffed. That is causing pinch points. But it's important to keep some context here. 95% of all flights are getting away. They are delayed by ATC and airport and handling delays, but they are getting away. People are getting to their destinations. Some airlines are cancelling a small proportion of their flights, between 5 and 10%, which is deeply regrettable. But this is one of the byproducts of the struggle to recover smoothly from 2 years of COVID lockdowns and government mismanagement over there. Completely to do with Brexit. I mean, an awful lot of these pinch points would be resolved very quickly and very rapidly if we could bring in European workers to do the jobs that, frankly, people in the UK are not applying for and don't want to do. This has always been the way the UK has provided our manned and staffed its transport industry, and it is the way forward. If we can't attract people to do those jobs, like baggage handling, like security at the airports, we're going to have to bring in workers, whether it's from Ireland or from continental Europe, to do them. And Brexit is one of the big bugbears in the system. It has introduced enormous labour market inflexibility in the UK, and there are hundreds of thousands of jobs in the UK that, frankly, British workers don't want to do. I think this problem is going to continue, particularly at those airports like Gatwick and Heathrow, right throughout the summer. I mean, it will be worse at weekends. It will be better during the week. There are less problems at airports like Stansted. Ryanair is operating a full schedule. We're fully staffed with pilots and cabin crew. But even we last weekend suffered 24% of our flights were delayed by air traffic control delays. Another 15% of flights were delayed by airport and handling delays. So I think it is going to be a struggle through the summer. The airlines, the UK airlines, BA, EasyJet, TUI, Ryanair and others, we will get 95% of, well, in Ryanair, we get nearly 100% of our people to their destinations, albeit with delays, but it will be a less than satisfactory experience, and this problem will not be resolved until we start allowing European workers to come in and do the jobs that, frankly, UK people no longer wish to do.
Welcome back to this special programme covering today's rail strikes. The Prime Minister said today that people need to get ready to stay the course, suggesting he believes that industrial action could last for quite some time. And the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, is said to be considering taking disciplinary action after several senior Labour MPs joined picket lines to support the strikers. Well, I'm joined now by the Labour MP and Shadow Attorney General, Emily Thornberry. Very good evening to you. And before we discuss the wider issues, which we will in depth, just that issue then of a whip and at least 3 PPSs disobeying the leader and appearing on picket lines. Will they be disciplined?
I honestly don't know. I mean, I would have thought that it was up to their immediate bosses, the Shadow Secretaries of State, to speak to them, find out what's going on, and I presume that the whips are going to be quite interested to know.
Well, one of them was a whip.
Well, that's what I've just been told. I mean, I don't know the details, to be honest, and it's not something I'm going to be.
But I mean, you think it should be delegated to the lower levels of Labour Party management? What about the leader, who said himself, who put out that memo saying, right, you know, no shadow ministers and no PPSs on the picket lines? It's pretty clear.
Well, I mean, all of this stuff is a team sport. You know, we all have different roles. And I'm here as the Shadow Attorney General, and as a member of the Shadow Cabinet, there's a certain amount of collective responsibility, but I'm not in charge of discipline, so I can't really help you. I'm sorry.
You almost sound as if you think they should be disciplined. Because many of your colleagues, I'm saying that because many of your colleagues suggest that they should not be, that this is not the way that Labour should be going.
I think that what we need to be doing is we need to be focusing on the issue itself and not falling into traps that are laid for us by this government. I think that actually what's happening is that they are using this, the government is using this as a wedge issue. I think they are trying to divide everybody up. I think what they're not doing is what a government ought to be doing in these circumstances, which is pulling both sides together, but also taking a seat at the table too. Because I think that at a time like this, we need to have a strategic view of where we're going with the railways, what government money needs to go into it, and what do we expect post-pandemic, where are we going? But instead, we have a government that throws petrol on the flames and just keeps trying to wind the situation up and shouts, Labour, 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 it's all Labour's fault. I think we need to step away from that and not be involved in that, but actually be saying to the government, this is how you should be behaving. This is what a sensible, grown-up, alternative government thinks you should be doing. And look at the way you are behaving. You are not making matters better. You are making matters worse. And I think the idea of, some of the more junior members of, the bag carriers in the Shadow team going on picket lines is a little bit of a distraction from that. So, that's unfortunate.
Yeah, but I mean, the point is...
But the important thing is that we hold them to account for the way in which they are simply making matters worse. And this won't be the only dispute.
OK, but I mean, you mentioned it being used as a wedge issue by the governments, and there's no doubt plenty of political commentators agree with you about that. But part of the problem from Labour's point of view is that you're allowing that to happen by being so mysterious about what your position is on this particular dispute.
Our position's not mysterious.
We know the demands. Right, OK. Is it 7%? Do you support 7% for railway workers?
Oh, I see. No, look, we can't be at the table saying this is the solution.
But you would be if you were the government.
Yeah, if we were the government, that would be a different matter. Absolutely. We would say, in principle, the government should be there and should be talking to both sides, and we should be talking about what changes need to be made, if any, how many, what's a reasonable amount for staff. We need to have a proper strategic overview of this, and we just have a government at the moment who, I mean, listen, we all know who Boris Johnson has breakfast with these days. He's having breakfast with, you don't know?
Well, Carrie Johnson, I suspect.
All right. Well, a later breakfast at 8:30 is with Linton Crosby. And in February of this year, in Australia, the government there had a rail dispute, and instead of getting involved in sorting it out, they spent all the time using it as a tool, as a weapon against the Labour Party.
OK.
This is the same stuff. This is the same playbook.
We know that is your analysis, but the problem is, as I say once again, is we don't know what Labour's position is. Do you support the strike? Because some of your colleagues have come out and say, yes, they may not have been on the picket line, but they see why the railway workers have gone on strike. But you said any strike is a failure. A failure by which side?
Well, both sides.
OK, so the unions have failed.
So Mick tonight has been saying
so the RMT have failed?
Mick tonight has said that we need to have it from the RMT. He said, you know, we need to have an agreement. Of course we need to have an agreement.
So is your message to the RMT, is your message to get back to the table right now, tomorrow?
Of course it is. And the railway companies. And, you know, Boris Johnson, don't stop yelling at people. Actually, you know, make sure you said, probably not you, but send someone who's sensible, who's thoughtful, who can be involved in the negotiations, and let's sort this out together. That's what we say. I think that's fairly straightforward. Whose side are we on? We're on the side of the commuters, of the workers who are trying to get to work. You know, we understand that there are circumstances in which people, you know, will exercise their right to strike. That's, you know, of course. But, you know, when it happens, it is a failure. It's a failure of negotiation and, you know, we need to get back around the
Well, it's happening right now and it's going to happen again on Thursday. Are you saying to the RMT, don't strike on Thursday, call it off?
It's
Get
up
back
to
to
them.
the table.
No. I mean, they are completely within their rights to have a strike. You know, I wish they wouldn't. I wish that there was an agreement. I wish that this hadn't happened. And I do condemn the government for not getting involved and instead for just making matters worse. That's my position. And I would say this is also a really important lesson for this government because we know that there will be disputes in all sectors of the economy in the near future, in the public sector too. And if this is how they're going to behave this time, then what are they going to be doing with all the other disputes that are happening? They really do need to think again that this is not about wedges, this is not about campaigning, this is about being a grown-up government.
Shadow Attorney General, we're out of time. Thank you very much indeed for coming along. Emily Thornberry there. And you're watching Sky News Tonight. Coming up at 8 o'clock on the programme, we'll be looking at how today's strikes on the railways have affected people right across the United Kingdom. Only about 20% of services were able to run. Stay with us.
The inspiration behind our product came from understanding how big of a problem livestock methane emissions were.